Okay, I think we're going to get started, if that sounds good to Dr. Byrd. Is that okay with you? All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Deepthi Chatty, and I'm an assistant professor of environmental justice in the Department of Environmental Studies here at Cal Poly Humboldt. We're going to begin today with a land acknowledgement and a labor acknowledgement. This event is being held under the organizational auspices of Cal Poly Humboldt. Cal Poly Humboldt is located on the present and ancestral homeland and unceded territories of the Wiyot tribe. Tribes and nations in Humboldt County include Hupa, Karuk, Matol, Tolowa, Wailaki, Wiyot, and Yurok. I personally today am located in the unceded territories of the Ohlone, the Ramaytush, the Awaswa, Muwekma, and Tamian Nation. We make this land acknowledgement in recognition that our words must be matched by action. There are many ways to take actions to match our words in our land acknowledgements. One way is to donate to the Wiyot tribe's honor tax. Another way is to donate to the Food Sovereignty Lab. And we encourage direct giving to tribes and native-led efforts. This event is being held in the United States. We recognize and acknowledge that the labor upon which the United States and its institutions are built are predicated on the labor of enslaved people who were kidnapped and brought here from the African continent. And we recognize the continued contribution of their survivors. We acknowledge all immigrant labor, including voluntary, involuntary, and trafficked peoples who continue to serve within our labor force. I'd now like to introduce our event for today. Welcome to Cal Poly Humboldt's Food Summit keynote webinar with Dr. Renée Byrd. The Food Summit is a 3-week-long event planned for April 6th to 20th, 2022, and is a partnership of campus collaborators who seek to elevate conversations and opportunities among students around issues of food justice, food sovereignty, food production, and working in food-related industries. This event is led by El Centro, funded by the Humboldt Energy Independence Fund, and supported by a variety of campus organizations, including the Food Sovereignty Lab, the Traditional Ecological Knowledges Institute, La Comida Nos Uno, RAP, Green Campus, OSNAP, the Social Justice Equity Inclusion Center, and the Umoja Center for Pan-African Student Excellence. Now I'm going to turn to what is the most pleasurable task, which is to introduce our esteemed speaker for today. Dr. Renée Byrd is an associate professor in the Department of English at Cal Poly Humboldt, the founder of Earthseed Laboratories, and the founding director of the Rose Brass Institute for Abolition Ecologies. Dr. Byrd received her BA in Ethnic Studies from Mills College and her PhD in Feminist Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. Dr. Byrd is an outspoken prison activist scholar whose research centers the intersection of race, gender, mass imprisonment, and neoliberal political rationalities. Dr. Byrd has won numerous awards and fellowships, including the Sociologist for Women in Society Chow Green Dissertation Scholarship, as well as the University of Washington's Graduate Medal. Her current book project is titled Punishment's Twin, Theorizing Prisoner Reentry for a Politics of Abolition. Outside of academia, Dr. Byrd has worked as a legal advocate for women prisoners with Justice Now in Oakland, as a family advocate for youth in the juvenile justice system, and broader on campaign work aimed at building a world without prisons. In collaboration with the Books Not Bars project of the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, Dr. Byrd helped produce the human rights documentary, System Failure, Violence, Abuse, and Neglect in the California Youth Authority, which is currently distributed by Witness NYC. Central to all of her work is the goal of using research and filmmaking as tools for building community and social movements. As I mentioned earlier, she's also the founder of Earthseed Laboratories, which is a community farm and retreat center grounded in abolitionist feminisms and BIPOC land justice. Earthseed is a place where activists, writers, artists, and other change makers from across the globe come together to slow down, break bread, restore ourselves, and practice new ways of being in the world. Earthseed is a place for radical experimentation, running counter to the long history of experiments which have treated BIPOC bodies as disposable. There are a lot of exciting things planned at Earthseed, and I hope Dr. Byrd will tell us about some of them today. I personally had the privilege of visiting Earthseed at its inaugural Juneteenth celebration last year, where Renee's dad fried fish and we had a fun potluck and went on little walks in the woods. And it was one of the most memorable days last summer. On a personal note, I'd like to say what an honor it is for me to introduce Dr. Byrd, who is not only an important mentor for me here on campus, but also one of my favorite people here at this institution. And I have the pleasure of calling Dr. Byrd both a mentor and a friend. Dr. Byrd's talk today is titled Growing Abolition Ecologies, Black Land Matters and Healing Justice in a More Than Human World. Dr. Byrd, we are so excited to learn from you, and I'm going to stop speaking now and turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chati. You're going to make me cry. Hello, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. I threw together a few slides so that we can have some images to illustrate some of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to go ahead and do that. All right, can everybody see that? Good, okay. Hello, everybody. Yeah, so I just want to say again, thank you so much, Dr. Chati, for that generous introduction. And to everyone who's made this talk possible, Amy Eitherburn, Carly Rojas, and so many others who have organized this gorgeous Cal Poly Humboldt Food Summit. So food is the foundation of culture, right? It's one of our most essential needs, and the practices we build around food, the meanings we make with those practices, and the structures we use to procure foods and share it are at the center of our ways of living. We're in the midst of enormous cultural change, and our food systems are a reflection of so many of the dynamics that we are outgrowing collectively. So I'm honored to participate in this incredible collection of events that make up the Food Summit, and to be in conversation with all of you. I'm going to try to keep my comments to 45 minutes so that hopefully we have time for questions and to hear other folks' voices instead of just me talking at you the entire time. So we, as humans, we're really making species level adjustments to our ways of being and living in the world. And spaces like this are so important as we think about and practice new ways of organizing ourselves and collectively meeting our needs. We must be deeply committed to transforming the ways that white supremacy, colonial relations of ruling, heteropatriarchy, nationalism, and ableism inflect our food and land practices. Just food and land practices can become the building blocks for the more just futures we long for. For the better part of 2 decades, I have been engaged in abolitionist movement building. I started out working with folks in women's prisons as a legal advocate around medical neglect and abuse inside. And the point of this work for me is always bound up with the freedom dreams that I learned really from folks inside who showed me how much genius and purpose we lock away in cages in our society. What excites me, well, and let's be honest, what terrifies me also about our contemporary moment is the unique convergence of crises that have emerged over the last 2 years. I'm hard pressed to see it as only coincidence that food insecurity, the pandemic, an elevating of racial justice initiatives, and a reckoning with police terror in Black and other and broader BIPOC communities have come to the fore in this moment. Today, I want to talk about the need for an analysis that takes seriously the connections between these issues. And I want to open up a space for thinking together about land-based practices that we can engage in to experiment with alternative systems of social provisioning that we might build liberatory cultures and futures. a number of years ago, I worked with Christina Pratt, a shamanic practitioner based in Oakland, and I highly recommend a book by Langston Kahn that you can see here, who also studied under her, and it contains many of the cycle of transformation teachings that Pratt and others have brought forth through what's called the Last Mask Center. Langston came out, with this book, Deep Liberation, and I highly recommend it. So Christina Pratt always used a phrase that has really stuck with me. She talks about, quote, meeting the challenges of our times. This is our job here in this lifetime, to meet the challenges of our times, to bring our unique gifts, our soul's purpose in this time and place. This phrase has stuck with me. There's, I think, a clarity that I find in it. I find that it's easier to let go of doubts, of fear, of other obstacles if I can stay focused on staying true to my sense of purpose. It seems to me that if we meet the challenges of our times head on and give our medicine to the world, then we can lay on our deathbeds without regret. We can let the cards fall where they may because we've given what we came here to give. As Audre Lorde wrote in The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action, when I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid. So this phrase, meeting the challenges of our times, has become an important root for me in this work. What does it mean to meet the challenges of our times with integrity, courage, creativity, and imagination? As I learn to mother my incredible daughter, Ida, I have to continually ask how I prepare her to meet the challenges of her times. I think this is the question of our lives. When my daughter was born, my understanding of abolition deepened in ways I could never have anticipated. It's not that abolition was purely theoretical before. Abolition for me has always been grounded in the material lives of imprisoned people and our communities impacted by that caging. But when my daughter was born, suddenly practice came to the fore in a new way. It seemed to me that there was no longer any waiting. I was building the world anew each day for her. What are the quotidian practices by which we build a new world in the here and now? So I'm going to say a little bit about abolition. Abolition is rooted in the understanding that we cannot reform torture, that caging people as a false solution to social problems like addiction, mental illness, and gender violence cannot be made humane, and that it is imperative that we get to the root of these problems and dynamics in our communities. Prison abolition is a political vision and broad strategy that aims to eliminate imprisonment, policing, and surveillance as methods of containment, control, and redress for harm. So this is often immediately dismissed as naive or utopian, right? However, as Angela Davis has written, abolitionism should not now be considered an unrealizable utopian dream, but rather the only possible way to halt the further transnational development of prison industries. The call for prison abolition urges us to imagine and strive for a very different social landscape, end quote. Given the imbrication historically of reform and the prison, an abolitionist approach is the most feasible method of genuinely transforming the conditions that lead people to commit crimes, the logics that inscribe criminality on particular racialized and classed bodies, and the seeming naturalness of incarceration as a response to these issues. Prison abolition refuses to view the prison or the police as isolated institutions. Rather, an abolitionist approach views the prison industrial complex as a set of relationships which must be transformed in order to build a more just world. Abolition becomes very difficult to imagine if we conceive of it as a vision limited to replacing our current criminal justice system with another system for dealing with violations of the law, absent an analysis of the relationships that underpin it. We must let go of this. These are Angela Davis's words again, quote, the desire to discover one single alternative system of punishment that would occupy the same footprint as that prison system, end quote. So because police violence and mass incarceration are co-constituted with long histories of enslavement, settler colonialism, gender violence, heteropatriarchy, and the accumulation of capital, abolition seeks to fundamentally uproot the relations at the heart of these systems. And I swear I'm going to connect this to food. So the carceral logics that make it imaginable to go from 300,000 imprisoned people in the US in the late 1970s to over 2 million a few decades later, those carceral logics are bound up with our food systems as well. The words Black Lives Matter are deeply meaningful because the structures which shape our lives treat us as disposable and commodifiable. The logics that make it intelligible to cage a vast portion of the population, particularly Black and brown folks, people in poverty, people who refuse to fit our narrow notions of gender and thus humanness. Those logics make it possible for us to have a food system characterized by synthetic herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers, exploitative labor conditions, lack of access to healthy and culturally appropriate food, and an honestly brittle system that sucks up fossil fuels, moving food across vast distances, eroding our soil, and reducing its nutritional profile. I'm going to assume that throughout this food summit, there are going to be plenty of presentations dealing some of those aspects of our agricultural landscape. So today I want to focus on situating these critiques in a framework of abolition ecologies, and to point to some of the ways that attention to Black ecological knowledges, frameworks of healing justice and abolitionist thought, and post-humanism can lead us to practices to transform our world. And I want to invite you all to become engaged with a land-based project right here in Humboldt called Earthseed Laboratories. So over the past year or so, I've begun to use this concept of abolition ecologies. I found myself dissatisfied with the way that social and environmental justice are discursively positioned as separate, even as we make the argument that they're bound up with each other. The deep social, let me take a drink here. The deep social and economic transformation that abolition calls for has always already been ecological. Alongside Earthseed Laboratories, a group of Cal Poly Humboldt faculty and activist scholars from outside of the CSU are designing a center for catalyzing radical ecological work called the Rose Bras Institute for Abolition Ecologies. And this is Rose Bras here speaking at an anti-fracking rally. I first met Rose when I was 19 and started doing work with Justice Now in Oakland, California. And I still remember I was so young and I thought she was just the coolest person I had ever met. I think she was like 45 or 50, but the first time I ever saw her, she was wearing these combat boots and I thought, okay, that's the kind of older person I want to be. So Rose was the first director of Critical Resistance, a national organization that's really been at the forefront of building a movement around abolition futures since the late 1990s. She was also deeply involved in environmental movements until her death a few years ago. In the early 2000s, she spearheaded some incredible coalitions between environmental, youth justice, and abolitionist groups to challenge the building of California's, I think it was the 22nd, I'm not sure now, our 22nd new prison that we built in 20 years. The Delano 2 prison. Bras and Critical Resistance worked with environmental lawyers to file Critical Resistance et al. And v. the California Department of Corrections. And they launched a national campaign to challenge the state's environmental analysis related to this prison. They used litigation as one strategy among many to shift public opinion and the discursive framing of prisons as inevitable. Rather than reformist reforms that so I use this distinction of reformist reforms versus non-reformist reforms, which really has its origin in the thinking of an early Marxist theorist, Andre Gors. But rather than reformist reforms that tend to bolster the system or stopping just this one prison, the campaign aimed for non-reformist reforms, a local struggle on the road to and grounded in a wider vision. So abolition isn't saying there aren't steps toward an abolition vision, but it's also about always really thinking about how to craft reform strategies that are grounded in and lead to that broader goal, and being really attentive to the way that reforms tend to make the system bigger, right? The whole history of prisons is really a history of reforms, and we've ended up with bigger, better prisons in different ways. And you see this in things like the trend around like gender appropriate corrections and this idea that we can perfect the prison into being some more humane thing, and what we end up with often is just more resources devoted to these systems. So this work that Rose Braz engaged in and Critical Resistance engaged in shows how coalitions can be built to help us understand that mass imprisonment and environmental degradation are not separate issues, and that it is in paying attention to connections across seemingly disparate issues that genuinely transformative work can happen. These edges are fertile, as I like to say. So I'm interested in abolition ecologies as a framework for a number of reasons. It makes explicit that challenging carceral logics is not just about human lives, but it's about the way that lives are made disposable across species difference. This interrogation of notions of the human can lead us to a deeper understanding of the history of white supremacist ideas. Abolition ecologies also grounds abolition, visions of abolition in concrete places, and expands our notion of harm to include harm to the land. I think it also pushes our ecological consciousness beyond the state as the solution. Too often mainstream environmental groups appeal to the state and to criminalization as solutions to issues from air quality to fracking. Abolition pushes us to see how, in doing this, we are reinvesting in the very structures we seek to dismantle. Abolition ecologies is not yet a fully formed kind of area of academic inquiry, not yet, but I would argue that abolition has always been ecological. From Harriet Tubman feeling the moss on trees to point her north, to contemporary prisoners devising medicine from dandelions in the prison yard. The liberatory visions of oppressed peoples and the incessant pursuit of healing in the face of state violence has always been engaged with particular lands and the spirits who reside therein. Okay, sorry, I'm gonna take a breath here. Let that soak in. So Nick Heinen has published a few papers theorizing this notion of abolition ecologies in the discipline of geography. And he writes to further quote, an emancipatory politics of land and property. I'm interested in building on that work, but also deepening the complexity of our thinking about what abolition might mean for our relations to land, and also how ecological relationships might instruct our efforts to build more liberatory ways of addressing violence in our communities. And this question of the logics of property is really central here. Lucille Clifton has a poem called Being Property Once Myself that I think provides an interesting window into my argument here. Being property once myself. Being property once myself, I have a feeling for it. That's why I can talk about environment. What wants to be a tree ought to be, he can be it. Same thing for other things, same thing for men. Clifton suggests an affinity between Black folks and the environment, grounded in a solidarity of having been conceived as property. as commodifiable and thus enslavable. Understanding the interconnections between the notion of property in Western law and white supremacist ideas of the human provide grounds on which to uproot these logics and to cultivate counter ideas, practices, and life ways. I come from a long line of Black farmers. My ancestral lineage is particular in that my Black ancestors never made the Great Migration to the North. Instead, they stayed in Arkansas and formed tight-knit communities, communities that I don't romanticize necessarily, but they, there's useful lessons in them. They relied on the broader white supremacist society for as little as possible. Prior to 1960, my grandmother maybe had one or two white people that she trusted somewhat. And beyond that, you can see this real attempt to create distance and, Black schools and Black spaces that were self-sufficient. Self-sufficiency is not a new trend. It's how my people made my life possible. I think it's kind of hilarious when people act like drinking apple cider vinegar for health is a new thing. My grandmother here, who passed away about 2 years ago, would tell us otherwise, and she would also tell us to add some cayenne pepper. While I understand the desire to create distance from farming and to conceive of that distance as progress, I think we as Black folks have medicine in our relations to land that can be the very healing balm needed for some of the contemporary crises that we face around food, around healing, and around violence. My talk today is very much in conversation with Soul Fire Farm, the broader renaissance we are seeing in Black farming. And I encourage you to also attend the Penniman talk next Tuesday. Given that she's speaking, I won't spend a whole lot of time today detailing some of the exciting legacies around Black farming and our ecological knowledges around African cultural retentions here. But I want to argue for opening our conceptions of agriculture, ecologies, and food justice to see what visions of abolition might allow us to build. I've recently been diving into this book by Chris Smaja, I think is how you say it, called Small Farm Future. He argues that organizing society around small scale farming offers the quote, soundest, sanest, and most reasonable response to climate change and other crises of civilization, and will yield humanity's best chance at survival, unquote. So I'm interested in this approach and asking what it might mean to blacken this analysis a bit and to push our notion of the farm further beyond the kind of heteronormative homestead or, the much valorized small family farm. How might community farms provide a center for radical practices that grow abolition futures? One small example is Earthseed Laboratories, an emerging community farm and movement space. Last June, we recently found investors to help us purchase 40 acres in the Redwood Creek watershed along Highway 299. It's about 25 minutes from Arcata up 299. And I hope that some of you will be inspired to become a part of this vision and to start other spaces and other projects where we can grow these possibilities. I will, maybe Amy, if you could put the link to the website in the chat. It's www.earthseedlabs.com. And I'll also make a plug because I feel like I don't know, this is key these days for some reason, but I'll make a plug for you all to follow us on social media at Earthseed Labs. We're on Facebook and Instagram. So Earthseed Laboratories is one space to experiment with this notion of abolition ecologies and to practice growing new ways of being in the world. The use of the term laboratories, and Dr. Chatti gestured toward a lot of, mentioned some of this, But the use of the term laboratories here is intentionally reframing how we think about experimentation and play. Our website reads, Earthseed is a set of laboratories, places for radical experimentation, running counter to the long history of experiments which have treated our bodies as disposable. It is spellcraft, countering statecraft. So the name Earthseed Laboratories takes inspiration from Octavia Butler's book, Parable of the Sower. It's a stunning example of Black feminist science fiction and Afrofuturism. And if you haven't read it, I encourage you to read it. And Parable of the Talents that comes after it. My mom always jokes that I could stand on this, like on a street corner proselytizing about this book. Anyway, but the book centers around a character named Lauren Oya Olamina, and she's the daughter of a Baptist minister, and she grows up in a small walled-in community. They're living in a dystopian future that's not that unlike our present. With each year that and each time I reread it, it's more and more like the world looks like that. And Lauren doesn't trust her father's God. And she finds brief moments throughout the plot of the text to write short poetic passages that form her own spiritual system called Earthseed. And Earthseed is based on what is in her time and place, and her really trying to kind of, well, to meet the challenges of her times, right? With courage and with imagination. And she makes space for writing short passages, you know, in the midst of scarcity and violence and migration and transformation. And I find that really inspiring, I guess, because, well, I don't know, right? It's hard to find time to write, but if you can find time to write like on the road, you know, certainly I can. So I try to kind of take inspiration from that. But within Parable of the Sower, the beliefs of Earthseed are recorded in the fictional book she's writing, Earthseed, the Books of the Living. And then portions of that text are littered throughout. The central idea, oh, hold on, okay. Am I not changing? Okay, hold on. The central idea behind Earthseed is encapsulated in the following verse here about change that you see on the right. All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. Change is inevitable. We can either collaborate with change and consciously adapt for our own survival as a species, or change can be something that happens to us. Something that we are simply the victims of without thought or agency. In the book, Lauren writes, a victim of God may, through learning adaptation, become a partner of God. A victim of God may, through forethought and planning, become a shaper of God. Or a victim of God may, through short-sightedness and fear, remain God's victim, God's plaything, God's prey. The word Earthseed embodies this idea that living beings on the earth can adapt and grow in a variety of environments and different situations. And that the task before humanity now is to see if we can evolve, make conscious choices about how we want to live, and save the planet from the processes we've set in motion of capitalist profit, greed, white supremacy, and environmental collapse. Can we bring ourselves into balance, heal, grieve, and learn new ways of living? So this project is called Earthseed Laboratories, not in order to reference dominant notions of Western science, but to rethink that legacy of knowledge production and herald a new relation to experimentation. In opposition to the long line of historical experiments which have treated the bodies of marginalized folks as objects, the experiments of Earthseed Laboratories are about playing with new ways of being in the world. It is an experiment in adaptation that we as a species might meet the challenges of our times, forge new practices of living, and heal the land and ourselves. So the project we're engaged in, some of the projects that we're engaged in right now, you can see the baby goats here, very exciting. 2 weeks ago, we had 2 baby Angora goats born. that's been very exciting. We're designing and constructing trails and outdoor altars to movement ancestors. The first of which will be the Harriet Tubman Trail. And I'm, this is still taking shape, but I'm really thinking about this trail and the altar at the end of it as a kind of ritual where people would walk the trail, leave an offering at the Tubman altar, and then return back up to the main farm area. And thinking about maybe experiences where we could have where folks would, explore ecopoetics and write as they move through that experience. We're also working on a garden that I've been thinking about as our Black and Indigenous Solidarity Garden, where medicinal plants from various traditions are brought into conversation, and where we sit with the really difficult questions around what it looks like to forge solidarity across our differences. We are going to be starting to grow food. There's just a lot. It's been less than a year since we closed on this land, and I'm learning a lot about taking things slowly, really trying to operate from a place of understanding that Earthseed isn't me, right? Earthseed is an emerging community, and it's not something that I can hold individually. It's something bigger than that. And so this year has pushed me a lot to let go of control. So I'm learning what I need to be learning. Healing justice. So central to this endeavor is the notion of healing justice. Cara Page from the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective writes that healing justice identifies how we can holistically respond to and intervene on generational trauma and violence, and to bring collective practices that can impact and transform the consequences of oppression on our bodies, hearts, and minds. Healing justice is about attending to our full selves as we engage in social justice work, and recognizing the incredible toll that these systems take and this work takes on our minds and bodies and spirits. I think we're in an interesting moment where we're seeing a real shift where the question of healing is coming to the fore. And I love this quote from Angela Davis. Our notions of what counts as radical have changed over time. Self-care and healing, and attention to the body and the spiritual dimension. All of this is now a part of radical social justice struggles. That wasn't the case before, end quote. And I can speak for myself personally that I definitely need to slow down, the need to move into right relationship with my body, and resisting the ways that fast kind of productivity, neoliberal time, the way that affects our movements is really imperative. And I'm seeing the way that if we're going to live to fight another day, we have to start to shift that. I can't say that I'm accomplishing that at an individual level, but Earthseed feels like a space for us to kind of collaborate collectively on this and deepen our knowledge that right relationship to land is coterminous with right relationship to the self, the body, and the community, and that those are co-constitutive processes. Prentice Hemphill, he used to be the healing justice director with Black Lives Matter. He's written that healing, quote, healing is being reclaimed from the mouths of those who use it without interest in true transformation, from those who mimic our ancestral practices to accumulate wealth. We are infusing the art and practice of healing with our souls, listening to our bodies and to our ancestors, and remembering that we don't heal only for the sake of feeling good. We heal so that we can act and organize. We heal so that we can use the lessons gained through the wounds of our trauma to make necessary change in our world, end quote. We are in a moment where the brittleness of our social systems is really being further exposed. Together, we can find the courage, integrity, and creativity to meet the challenges of our times shed practices and ways of being that we are outgrowing, and curate relations based on human flourishing. Thank you. And that's all I'm going to say for now. I'd love to have more of a conversation with folks than just me talking.
Wow. Well, thank you, Dr. Byrd, for that absolutely fantastic talk and beautiful photographs. And I've just been furiously typing notes as you were speaking, because so many of the words you said were so beautiful. I wanted to revisit them. I want to open it up to our audience. And I think Amy has kindly reminded us the mechanisms by which the audience members can participate in conversation with you. You know, and I also just, you know, encourage you, if you put something in the chat or in the Q&A, I'm happy to sort of read it out for our speaker, or if you want to engage in any other way. So I just want to give folks a minute to gather their thoughts and type in some reflections, questions. We've got something in the Q&A. Well, hi, Laura. Dr. Laura Johnson says, amazing talk, Dr. Byrd. And I wish Laura could unmute herself and just say whatever herself. But yeah, it is an amazing talk. Okay.
Yeah, I just want to say how much I love Dr. Laura Johnson. I mean, you've been so inspirational to me in so many ways. You introduced me to Bioecomalefe's work, which just kind of exploded my brain in so many ways. And yeah, I appreciate it. Hopefully I didn't talk too fast, but.
Well, while folks are sort of gathering their thoughts, I wonder if I could just use my privilege of having a mic and ask you a couple of questions and just kind of thoughts that struck me. So I was really, you know, I loved what you said about, you know, the kind of co-constitution of thinking of self-care as a radical act and thinking of care for one's body and one's land, and thinking about sort of changing the relationship to body and land. And then I was also thinking that in your talk and when you've spoken elsewhere, you use the word play a lot, and you use the word sort of, you don't use the word work as much as you use the word play. And I really love that. And so I was kind of wondering, and then you also talked about, you know, writing and finding time for writing and scraps of paper and writing on the move and, you know, all of that. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about your work and play as a professor at Humboldt, or as a professor more broadly, as a scholar, and then your work and play in your organizing work, you know, when it comes to all of the sort of activism that you're engaged in, and then your work at Earthseed. Kind of just say a little bit more about how you think of these things together. What is work? What is play? Are those boundaries blurred? You know, yeah, just say a bit more about that.
What a wonderful question. Okay, I love this question. This is probably the question I need to be thinking about most. I don't know that I have any beautiful, perfect answers for you, but I'll say a couple of things. You know, one, I think the notion of experimentation and coupled with that play is very important, because I think I think our approaches to many of the challenges that we face are very, I guess, I don't know what I want to say. I want to say that, you know, I think that it's a struggle for all of us to not want to be right, but to, you know, we kind of cling to being right. You know, we need to be right. And when we're talking about questions of our survival, right, I mean, that's very understandable. At the same time, I think politically, there's something really important about being open to uncertainty, to the unexpected. You know, Stuart Hall talks about this as a politics without guarantees, that, you know, we can't really be sure that we're right. And I find that a useful place to stay. You know, when I'm sure I'm right, usually a spirit's about to kick me in the ass, probably. usually it's like, you know, be careful. And I think, you know, Stuart Hall talks about a politics without guarantees. That's very much about a politics where we constantly kind of question and operate from this place of unsureness about being right, and about the outcomes of our political tactics and the struggle that we're engaged in, right? That we can think we have the right strategies and the right message and the right, all of that right stuff, but the outcome is not predetermined, right? And just, you know, I mean, what will work is not something we can always foresee. And so I really, and I understand the impulse for answers, right? If our problems were such that we could have easy digestible answers, like I would love that. That would be great. Except I think we are getting to a point where we realize that's not the case, right? And so I guess I think that play and experimentation is really important, particularly in abolitionist thought, because we want to have, you know, we want to say, okay, fine, prisons are bad, throw them away, give me something else that we can put there. And we end up often kind of being willing to accept Band-Aid kind of approaches because it makes us feel like we're able to do something, right? So I think the like deep kind of, I don't know if I want to call it love, but like this deep love that seems to be expressed sometimes for in some circles for a little while for body cameras on police officers. It was like that was going to solve it, right? And that, like, you know, there was a moment, and I don't think, you know, young people might not feel this way anymore, but there was a moment, I think like 15, 20 years ago, where it was like, if we could just capture these police murders on camera, then it would all get solved, right? And I think what we've seen, right, is no, like some people can watch and say, well, he was just doing his job or whatever, even as people are like literally shot in the back or something, right? And so it seems like we don't have, so anyway, I guess, sorry to get kind of traumatic on us, but I think for me, I've really tried to push myself with this notion of play and experimentation a bit, because that's something that's hard for me, you know, like I like being right. I like knowing the answers. I do like controlling things. And, but I also think, and I think probably as a collective, you know, we're in a space where we really like that, but I think we're really being really tasked to let go a bit of control, of certainty, and that like in being uncertain, that's actually where we find a lot of answers in a way, right? Even provisionally.
I just love that answer. It makes me think of two more things I'll say very, very quickly, but then we've got two more questions from the audience. I want to read them out to you. The first thing it makes me think of is sort of this idea of epistemological humility, that we don't know all the answers, that we can be open to being wrong, right? And I think of, you know, when we think of, say, climate justice or taking action in this present moment of like, how do we bring our talents for the present challenges, you know, part of it is to be open to working with people who will show us that we are wrong, right? And to be open to be working together, where we have to sort of work in coalitions with people who will point out our mistakes to us. So if that's like one thing I think of. And I'm going to read out the other questions before I could talk endlessly about.
Can I say one thing though?
Yeah.
I do need to, can I just respond really quick though to what you're saying? Because I think it's so important. And I feel like, I don't know, I feel like I have like some pandemic brain where like, I won't get back to this if you ask the other questions now. So I do just want to say like, yes, I think that question of epistemological humility is so central. And, you know, it's just, anyway, I just want to underscore that I think that it's very, very difficult. But I think, you know, it's precisely the kind of courage we need, the courage to be wrong and to say, okay, well, I'm going to turn around and pivot and go this way. And you know, and to keep learning. And I think particularly in discussions around climate change, I think we get into that where it's like the science proves this, and if people would just see it, we would do the right thing. And, you know, hey, I wish it was that easy. It's just, it's not, right? Like if there's a lot more going on there. And so, you know, I think we have to ask a lot more complex questions about what it means to know and what kind of knowledge we act from, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've got a question from Octavia Holt, who is a brilliant student in my class and one of my advisees. I'm so glad, Octavia, you made
And
it
her
here.
name is Octavia, so I already know you.
Yeah. So Octavia asks, you mentioned the Soul Fire Farm. Can you elaborate on the relationship of that, please? And then should I read out Katie Kozilak's question as well? The amazing Katie Kozilak is in the audience and has written a wonderful paragraph. So I'm going to read out Katie's question, and then you can maybe talk about both of them. So Katie says, I was so moved by the many connections between abolition and ecology you presented today, Dr. Byrd. I think this work is remarkably groundbreaking. I'd be interested in hearing more about your thoughts on the connections between commodification and exploitation of land and the exploitation of bodies and labor. I'm wondering how you think we get more people to realize the interconnections. I'm in a lot of conversations where there seems to be strong division between environment and social dimensions. And in some spaces, the discursive divide even seemed to be getting stronger. Yeah, I would agree with Katie. And this goes to the thing that we were just talking about, a little bit in terms of sort of how do you work in coalition with people that, sometimes if we point out you're wrong. What might you suggest as tangible methods to continue breaking down this separation? So 2 great questions.
Oh, wow. Okay, 2 really great questions. I think that I'll at first try to address them separately, but we'll see where we end up. There may be connections that I'm not yet seeing. So Octavia, yeah, Soul Fire Farm. I find the work of Leah Penniman and her sister super inspiring, and I'm really so Earthseed Laboratories and Soul Fire Farm don't have any formal connections. I am hoping at some point that we will put Earthseed Laboratories on there's a reparations map that Soul Fire Farm manages of different farms and kind of spaces. And that's been on my list of something to do. But more broadly, I think that Soul Fire Farm is an important example that represents a kind of larger renaissance that's happening around Black farming. And so, for me personally, at least, my work at Earthseed Laboratories feels very connected to my ancestors, and somehow it feels really important to kind of invoke and honor my grandmother and her mother and her mother's mother in these conversations, and probably for a lot of reasons that I can't even fully articulate. And so I guess I feel an affinity for Soul Fire Farm because it's often kind of the most visible, I think, organization and farm of a whole it's kind of the top of an iceberg, of an entire iceberg of kind of Black farming stuff that's happening. And I guess I'm really also I have a lot of gratitude to them for kind of doing some of that work, right? Like, I don't know if I could, all of the lectures that the Penniman sisters give just in explaining to some very mainstream environmental audiences. This is where we might segue to Katie's question, but like these presentations that they give over and over and over again, kind of explaining that like Black people's relationship to land is not solely defined by enslavement. Slavery doesn't represent this kind of radical break before, like people brought seeds in their hair, right? That like we brought Indigenous knowledge to this country, and that the Middle Passage doesn't represent a fundamental break there, even as it's this structuring experience, right? That's particular. And so, yeah, I guess I felt the need to just address that and encourage the audience to go to the Penniman talk on Tuesday, because it feels like, I don't know, it feels like they're out in the front doing some work with kind of mainstream agricultural communities that I think is really important. And I think we're at a moment in terms of just Black communities where like our capacity is, I don't know, I think there's a need to turn inward sometimes too. And I just feel like they're doing a lot of work out there, kind of getting people in kind of mainstream environmental and agricultural circles on board to like recognize, I mean, even, you know, nationally, I'm expecting as the Farm Bill is negotiated here in the coming year or so, that like Black farmers are going to be centered in that, and that equity in agriculture is going to be really centered in that, I think. And I think a lot of that work, I mean, can be attributed to a lot of different groups, but Soulfire Farm, I think, has definitely done some really, really important work in kind of making that happen. I'll make a plug for this wonderful book that I have that's called, and it's got the Penniman's sisters on the front, and I just love it. We Are Each Other's Harvest, Celebrating African-American Farmers, Land, and Legacy. And it's by the author, if you don't know the show Queen Sugar, do people know the show? Oh, you have to watch Queen Sugar, Deepti. It's fabulous. So this show, Queen Sugar, is really good, and it's based on a book, and the author of that book put together this collection of different kind of voices around Black land, and it's pretty cool. And so yeah, I'm excited to see kind of what the future holds, where, you know, there's a way in which when I started doing abolitionist work 20 years ago, like, I mean, people thought I was crazy for many reasons. Abolition was a crazier idea back then. Now it's like entered the mainstream. And certainly the idea of a farm grounded in abolition is thinkable now in a way that it wasn't then, right? That like it was, you know, it just sounded a little hooky back then, right? This like abolitionist healing farm that read differently in 2004, right? And so I feel like we're in a moment where some new visions are intelligible. Yeah, so Octavia says in the Q&A, I'm reading Leah Penniman's book, Farming While Black, and Queen Sugar is really good. Yeah, so Leah Penniman has that book, Farming While Black, and I love that book. It's really, really great. In relation to Katie's question, I don't know, I'm still struggling with this, and I really want to struggle with you, Katie, on this question of like how we, and it does seem like there's some kind of territorial turf stuff that happens around, and I think some of that gets wrapped up in the whole polytech thing that, you know, that like there's money to be had for certain things. And so what kind of environmentalism or sustainability Cal Poly Humboldt will represent is territory kind of. And I don't know, I think we have to be really careful about that jockeying for some. I know that there's some of that going on, and it's hard. I don't know that I have any answers for it, but it feels like that's kind of the question of how much is social justice or equity going to be a part of the environment stuff that's our signature, is this question that's really difficult. And I think we need to put our resources less toward marking out territories and more toward having conversations that where we're not just owning all these things, but we're like really like, I don't know, it just feels like, yeah, I don't know, there's some like needing to bring us to the table that doesn't seem to happen. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but it seems like sometimes the resource questions and money questions make people further retreat to their camps and their positions, and then it makes it even really hard for us to be in that kind of epistemological humility that Dr. Chati mentioned, of just being willing to like learn something different, or, you know, for me, I guess, and I think Dr. Chati, you've encountered Margot Okazawa-Ray through the ENC stuff, but you know, she always told me to stay humble, and she's all about making connections, right? That like both with people, but also connections between issues. And I think that's where this work is. And I think, you know, I think sometimes people could accuse me of being kind of overly complicating stuff. But I think it's in the connections between this stuff rather than separating out our territories that we're going to find really productive and transformative work. And so I think we need more connections and less, there's something kind of disciplinary and disciplined about our territorial, whose space is this and who's the person that does this, and all of that feels like we've got to outgrow it, or or we're just not, you know, we have to outgrow it. So.
Here. Yeah, I'm all for that. I've been, I say to some people that I used to call myself as an interdisciplinary person, and now I'm trying to call myself an undisciplined person, because the very act of disciplining, right, of making yourself into a scholar of a certain discipline, you know, to me that has that negative connotation. You're like disciplining yourself to sort of not be at the edges, at the fertile edges that you talked about, right? It's coming to like a clean center, a clean core, which then doesn't allow for these unexpected connections, entwinings with new ideas, or like embracing some messiness, which might allow for that sort of creative play.
Yeah, and it's about kind of making ourselves intelligible in our territory, as if being intelligible is always the worthy goal, right? Like, I think we need to question some of that. I mean, and I don't know. I mean, I get it, right? Like, sometimes I have a deep need to be intelligible, and I'm like, why am I explaining myself? Maybe it's okay to be confusing, but like, I think we have to I think we need to start to value that kind of undisciplined, the kind of boundary crossing, the fertile edges a lot more, rather than thinking that belonging comes in like having these camps, you know?
And having ownership then of that camp too.
Yeah, and it's not like I'm saying that we wouldn't have, like, I'm not saying a wishy-washy, don't have political commitments kind of thing, right? Like, I think we have to be very clear about what we're talking, you know, I'm like, yes, I'm saying no to caging, right? There are positions, right? But I think it's about our orientation toward those positions that, you know, when abolition becomes just like a t-shirt that you're gonna wear, that's like, well, then you've politically neutered it, right? Like, it's messy, playful, experimental kind of openness that has to be maintained for it to be productive, I think, politically.
Yeah, love that. I love that. Katie, I hope that, you know, sort of attends to some of what you were asking about in your really generative question, but feel free to pop something more in the chat. I realize I don't know if we have a hard stop. Amy and Carly, sorry, let us know if we're supposed to close anything at any point. And Dr. Bird, please let me know.
We're supposed to go to 2, but you know, I do theoretically need to pop over to a faculty meeting, but
all right, yeah.
I'd much rather talk about uncertainty and edges with you. But yeah, I am missing the English faculty meeting, and I feel like I'm so excited and grateful to be in the English department now. I feel like it's epistemologically kind of opened up a whole lot of spaces, and so I do feel like sometimes I should be a good colleague, and you know.
I hear you. Well, I'm so happy for your new home and for it being a fertile playground for you as you continue to work on these exciting things. And thank you once again to Amy and Carly for organizing the tech and you know, putting together this event. And thank you again, Dr. Byrd, for your wonderful scholarship, creativity, passion, ideas, energy, everything that you shared with us today. And thank you to the audience for your wonderful questions and for being a part of this great event. Great. Okay.
Thank you so much. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Should I leave now?